Hello, welcome to the 2021 Innovation for International Development Expo. My name is Rhonda Hahn. I work in Global Engineering Programs and Partnerships. Together with the Shah Family Global Innovation Lab, we host the I2D Expo every year. This year has been a totally virtual expo, and we appreciate that you joined us. This is the final panel discussion, and tomorrow is our big celebration. We have heard from incredible thought leaders over the past 2 weeks. People working in international development have shared their knowledge, their lessons learned, and their best practices. We saw student poster presentations by the 3 award winners. We got to listen to Purdue faculty present their proposals for seed grant funding and got to witness their dedication and their passion to trying to find solutions to many of the challenges that the world is facing today. Everyone will take something different away from this year's expo. I personally listen for the human side of the conversation. I appreciate that our panelists have pointed out how difficult it can be, how mistakes will be made, and that you'll get very used to feeling awkward, but that it's a worthwhile endeavor and that it's very important. Go to our website next week and listen to the recorded panels that you have missed and see what takeaways that you can take away. In a few minutes, I will turn it over to our moderator, but I want to remind you that tomorrow we will hear from Dean Meng, from Assistant Dean of GEPP, George Chu, and Shah Lab benefactor Manu Shah will deliver the keynote address. We will also present the Shah Lab Seed Grant Awards. It'll be a grand party, and if you would like a calendar invitation, we'll put the registration link in the chat box below. So today's topic is scaling for impact, and I will now hand it over to our moderator, Diana Harbison. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. I'm Diana, Assistant Director for International Development here at Purdue, also in the same office as Rhonda. She and I are now managing the Shah Lab activities and this expo this year. Thank you to Pallavi for leaving us in good hands. And thank you, Pallavi, for joining us today for the conversation about scaling up. Pallavi is now the program director for Laser Pulse, a USAID funded program that delivers research-driven solutions to field source development challenges. But most of us know that before joining Purdue, she focused almost exclusively on scaling up innovations for social challenges. So we're glad to have her here today. Along with her, we have Esther Obonyo, Associate Professor of Engineering Design and Architecture at Penn State and Director of Global Building Network. So today we're going to have our panelists give a quick introduction of themselves in much greater detail than I just provided, and share some opening remarks about the topic that we'll discuss today. They'll take about 10 minutes so that we have the bulk of our session to take audience questions and interact with each other and the audience. So audience, feel free to put your question in the chat box and I'll be happy to pose it to the panelists. And I expect a lot of questions today because this is the most challenging stage of the work that any of us do. It is not easy, so I expect a lively discussion. So with that, I'll actually begin with Esther and invite her to make her opening remarks and introduce herself more fully. Welcome, Esther.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Diane, and thank you to the conference organizers and also Purdue University for including me in this discussion. So as you've heard, I'm currently at Penn State University. My background is in the design and construction of buildings. I work in 2 areas, artificial intelligence, distributed artificial intelligence systems for knowledge management and knowledge sharing. And then I also look at sustainable structural materials. Everything I do is prefixed with the phrase low cost. I have a passion and an interest in trying to point these building related solutions to problems that affect vulnerable populations, especially those people who are living in areas that are prone to extreme weather events such as hurricane and flooding. We've done work in Kenya, Tanzania, Mexico. I've had some engagement in India. Currently, I'm working as a virtual visiting professor to the Philippines, and it's the same thing. Like, even when we're not talking about buildings, we're trying to learn from the interventions that are being used in other sectors. As part of my journey to try to broaden my understanding of non-built environment related things that can affect scale. I spent 1 year working as a Jefferson Science Fellow in Washington, DC. I also spent a sabbatical year in New York, because at that particular time, market-based solutions was a hot word. And I thought, maybe that is the answer to scale. At the moment, as you've heard, I'm directing the Global Building Network. It's a partnership with one of the UN agencies. And then even there, we're looking at issues related to energy use and finding this pathway to scale, because the adoption rate of energy efficiency technologies is between 1% and 2%. And we can, use similar numbers for several other things, including, nature-based systems for building construction. I'm going to share my slides. Just give me a minute, and I'll show you one of the recent things that's keeping me awake at night. Please let me know if you see my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can. It looks great. If you could just do slideshow presentation. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So Kindu Bay, Kenya. So this is the birthplace of my parents. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, but over the last few months, I've traveled to Kindu Bay because of my parents not doing too well, and I had an eye-opening experience. I've always thought of the Lake Victoria part of Kenya from a very biased perspective. When the few times I frequent the area, I visit the area, I see the hyacinth weed problem. I also see and hear people talk about using the phrases that the locals use, shrinking Lake Victoria is shrinking. And in December and also March, I started learning from the local community about a different problem that is never really discussed as much. There are parts of Lake Victoria, and this is true for Kenya, it's true for Uganda, and it's also true for Tanzania. There are parts of Kenya where the waters of the lake are considered by the locals to be swelling. So what you see, actually that was in the first slide, sorry. So what you see here is the road, part of the road that leads to the new pier. The picture to the right, believe it or not, there is a road, and I was on that road in December. We drove up to the end of the road, and we sat there for a bit and enjoyed the scenery and the view. 3 months later, this is what it looks like. The water levels are rising, and it's rising very rapidly. This was in March, and they were having some rains, but the heavy rains had not started. The heavy rains started in April. So this situation is something that's like unfolding, and it's unfolding now, and it's happening at a much, much faster rate than what was there before. So this picture, you see structures. These are from pre-colonial days and the 70s. This used to be a cotton processing plant, and it's no longer functional for several reasons. There are some political aspects to the reason why it stopped functioning, but also at the physical facility level, because of the rising waters of Lake Victoria, this structure is no longer accessible. And according to the locals, they believe that it's just a matter of time before these structures are completely submerged by Lake Victoria, because there are other structures, including the old pier, that have been completely submerged. So the rate at which the submerging of the buildings happened over a 40-year period is much slower than what is happening in the last 2-3 years. And then I took this picture because, again, my background is design and construction of buildings. So if I was to limit myself to things which are within that definition of how building materials perform, how do you integrate them into building systems, that is all I would be focusing on. I would show up and want to give this community a building material for the wall that can resist flooding, for example. We can engineer it from a material science perspective and make sure that we're using as much of the locally available materials as possible. But will that really be helping them? I'll stop sharing for a moment. The problem with this approach and the reason why it doesn't scale, it's because even though an adequate structure is important, even though using locally available materials are important, when you talk to the local community members, they'll tell you problem number one is something to eat, right? They used to be able to fish, or they used to be able to get fish at affordable rates. Right now, the fish that is available, most of it, the stock of the fish has declined. And you can connect this to global warming and the changing conditions within that larger ecosystem. The stock of fish that is available is being transported in vast quantities to Nairobi. So what is left for the local population to consume is very, very limited. You can say, well, we can turn them into smallholder farmers. The soil in that region is black cotton soil. It doesn't support a lot of crops. It supports cotton, it supports peanut. The industry that was available for value addition is no longer in place for so very many reasons. Some of it can be resolved through, say, let's try to get startups, entrepreneurship activities, cottage industries. That will help a little bit, but it's not going to solve everything that needs to be solved. The type of convening power required to address the problems of this relatively small community, talking about 50,000 people, 5,000 people in the town and maybe 50,000 people in the immediate vicinity, is going to require actions that involve several government agencies. So, and then it's also impossible to do this without a buy-in from the communities. Some of the complaints that are consistent with what we've learned in other parts where we've approached a community to try to bring resilient housing solutions, they complain that they are not being engaged as partners. They are seeing the interventions as being driven by an agenda that has been crafted by an outsider. They want their voices heard. And they don't want surveys. They're talking about co-creation, co-development. Why is this a challenge? Because building technologies and systems, that's a very technical subject, but I'm challenging people in my discipline and saying that if I can go to a doctor's office without medical knowledge and I'm out in 5 minutes and I know how sick I am, we can do better jobs as engineers, as architects, of making sure that the information that we're sharing with the local people is packaged in a language that they understand, in a language that empowers them to want to engage with us in the design process. So I'm going to stop at that for now. Actually, no, the last piece I wanted to add here, they're also curious about other parts of the world. They realize that there are people who are living in similar conditions and they want to learn from them. And when they see someone like me, a professor from the US, they ask questions about poor households in the US, poor communities in Latin America, in India. They want to know, is there hope? Is there a success story? Is there a model that is giving people in a low-income community hope that can be adapted, not replicated, but can be adapted? Thank you. I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Esther. I'm going to move to Pallavi and invite her to make her opening remarks and more fully introduce herself, even though she's so well known to everybody here today. Pallavi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me on the panel. And I see Amos has joined, so hi, Amos. Thank you for joining as well.
Hi, Pallavi. Good to see you.
To see you as well. So in addition to, as Diana mentioned, I'm currently serving as the program director for Laser Pulse, which is a 70 million USAID funded program over 5 years, and we are in the middle of that program. So a quick plug for folks to go and check out laserpulse.org to find more information. But before that, I spent about 14 years working across different sectors. I worked as an engineer in India and Singapore. And then I worked as a strategy consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC in London. And that was where I first started working with international development agencies like DFID and multiple projects funded by CEDA and USA. I worked with US government on policy projects with Scotland Police Department, Department of Education and stuff. And then I moved back to India to work with the government of my state, Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the largest states in the country. And with them, we designed a methodology to basically pick the social innovative models that have already been working in a small scale, say 2 villages or 10 villages, and replicate it across the state using government infrastructure. So if there is a solution that is catering to, say, tuberculosis and is being run by a social enterprise or an NGO, but is running well, we would bring that organization along with the government entities from health department and corporate leaders to then co-create a model using that same innovation in a way that it can reach multiple folks. So for example, in this case, if the tuberculosis model worked, we will use the government primary healthcare centers to replicate in a way that it would reach millions of people. So my work there, and I'm stressing on this, my work was there to not innovate or re-innovate anything. My job there was to identify where the necessary skill sets and the necessary resources are that are needed to scale the solution and bring those individuals and those stakeholders together to form a strategy to scale that. And a lot of the skill sets I used there was from in my engineering background. Okay, how do we do systems approach? Or from my strategy consultant background, where I would devise strategy and then bring folks on board and stuff like that. And I mentioned this whole, experience because I'm going to, in my opening statement, I'm going to use that knowledge. And because my stint at academia is relatively new, I'm going to combine some observations from what I've seen in these different sectors from my naive perspective, and articulate three key areas where I think the stress needed to be put in order to design the scaling of the scaling of the solutions. So as I see, the major role of university is knowledge creation and problem solving. Now, when seen from the context of social economic problem solving, universities have a major role to play in conducting research and producing solutions, much like what Esther said, and Amos will also build upon that later. And these innovations can actually hold the key to large scale impact. But what I want to point out that these innovations itself are not impactful, right? They are innovative and they're novel, but they're not impactful. The impact will happen when these innovations are scaled. And there's a step in the middle, which is dissemination. And dissemination is the key in scaling these solutions. So I'm going to work on that a little bit. So in my opinion, the dissemination of knowledge and of research output can take three major routes. It can be via publications, it can be via partnerships, and it can be via IP, intellectual property protocols and guidelines. So let's start with academic publications. I'm not a researcher, but this is my observation, and I'm going to post this for discussion. If a researcher finds out a way to solve a critical global challenge and publishes it only in academic journals, that's great, actually, if the agenda is only to create knowledge. But let's all be honest and accept it. Practitioners are not necessarily on top of their game of reading various academic journals to be apprised of all the new innovations coming in that sector. Not to mention that these academic journals are expensive. They can be anywhere between $200 to $550, making the access extremely difficult for practitioners. Now, in order for the uptake of their solutions by the practitioner community, I think researchers need to put sincere effort in creating bite-sized or smaller write-ups, simple enough that a layman community or practitioner community can read and understand, perhaps in form of, say, articles or blog pieces that can go into places like LinkedIn or Medium or Stanford Social Innovation Review or DevX, DevNets, and multiple such platforms. These are the platforms where communities of practitioners, NGOs, social entrepreneurs are there. They are looking for solutions, right? So this is where they will find these solutions, these ideas, and probably work on it. Now, for researchers also, I think it's a good plug for them when they're writing these small pieces. They can actually cite their own publication. That way, they are diverting these communities to go check out their publication, right? So think about that. That's a very effective strategy, as I see, of routing readers to their own publication. So that was about publication. And I want to touch upon partnerships, and especially multi-sector partnership. This route is mostly relevant to researchers and faculty who also have some entrepreneurship bent, right? Who want to take the onus of implementing their ideas and their solution themselves, say by starting a company or a social enterprise. Now, here the critical piece is multi-sector partnership. Even if the researcher is extremely resourceful, right, there are some challenges that actually lie beyond their research expertise and perhaps beyond their knowledge set. So for example, one of the Shah Lab's BME faculty is working on diagnosing cervical cancer at point of care. Now she has created the prototype in her lab, and she's doing, creating evidence of the tech's working. But these kind of mobile handheld technologies are very good for developing countries where the medical infrastructure, health infrastructure is not as strong, right? So we are talking about her device reaching at point of care in rural areas, let's say in India, right? But she's sitting here. She doesn't have necessarily all the idea of how the frontline workers work, what language they use, and stuff like that. So at some point, she has to, and she's already is, she's thinking about who can she partner, right? Say a manufacturer partner who can help her create those kits, those medical kits at scale that can then go into, stores or clinics or pharmacies for people to purchase and use. Or she would need somebody to advise her on the FDA regulation, and guidelines in India. Somebody she needs to partner with, like medical representative who can go to doctors and promote it, supply chain, knowledge transfer, marketing promotion, all these things that is not her core area of expertise. Neither her expertise nor that she actually has time to go into India and figure that out herself. So just reiterating the importance of multi-sector partnerships, right? That's my second point. Third and last point, and I apologize, I know a lot of folks here are students, and this is a very difficult area for me personally. But intellectual property is a big problem as I see it, and it's a complex one. To quote Noam Chomsky, actually has very strong stand on IP in general, where he calls it as a tool of monopolizing pricing power, and says that IP uptake by universities in 80s had a, his words, cheapening effect. I am using very strong words, but these are his words. Now, I don't agree to it fully, but I think there is some value in that argument. And here's how I see it. I was going through a recent research that came out of Wharton, that the topic of the research is benchmarking US university patent value and commercialization efforts. And this paper shows how universities have actually borrowed and replicated the IP commercialization protocols and guidelines from the corporate sector. Now we have to understand that companies' agenda is private value creation, whereas universities' agenda is social and economic value creation. And they do that via research, innovation, and their student body, right? But following in the footsteps of private sector companies, universities have ended up creating repositories of innovative ideas stacked behind a paywall, available only to donors who can afford it or corporates who can pay for it. Most of these ideas don't even see the light of the day. The research shows only 16% of IPs ever get commercialized, right? Think about it, what a big loss of the innovations. So here we are seeing that these paywalls and these very rigid IP commercialization protocols actually deprive, in some sense, the larger nonprofit or civil society sector that can potentially use these IP, customize it and build on it. And yes, I agree, it should be available for corporates because, market forces are important players, but there should be a way, and this is my pitch, there should be a way to share it with the nonprofit sector as well under different, say, dollar expectation, perhaps, the humanitarian IP, much like Gates Foundation and how they do it. And I want to put a plug for Shah Lab here, actually, because Shah Lab in last year and up until earlier this year has made some headway in democratizing the IP creation, IP that is being created in partnership with our nonprofit partners. We are now working with, SPS office and OTC in extending the IP ownership to our partners as well. So I'll stop there and appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Pallavi. And Pallavi would be too humble to say that she was actually singly responsible for making that possible, the patent language accommodation that Purdue is now including, and it's a leadership opportunity for Purdue because she looked high and low for examples and couldn't find them. So it's unique and lucky that Purdue had someone like Pallavi to lead that march. Amos Winter, thank you so much for joining us from a beautiful surrounding that's behind you, sir. So Amos Winter is Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering and the Director of Global Engineering and Research, Gear Lab at MIT. And my colleague Rhonda is going to show your slides for you. But if you'd like to introduce yourself more fully and deliver your remarks, please.
And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Great. I apologize, everybody. I'm in rural West Virginia, of all places, right now, but I'm very glad I can join in today. Yep, I'm a associate professor of mechanical engineering at MIT, and what we're talking about today is certainly near and dear to my heart. My research group is called the Global Research and Engineering Lab, the Gear Lab. Sorry, Global Engineering and Research Lab. Sorry, I'm part of this cross-country crazy race right now, so I haven't slept much in the last few days, so a little loopy. But anyway, what my research group focuses on is creating technologies for developing and emerging markets. Is that we try to get a really deep perspective and an understanding of the market context in which we work, by primarily working with market leaders around the challenge areas that we're focused on, to understand, what are the market drivers, who are the customers, what does the whole supply chain look like, what do the value propositions look like, and then we try to find what I term the technological keystone of these problems, where there's a very difficult technical challenge, nobody's figured this out before, and it requires MIT rigor of research to realize that keystone. And then by following this model, we're hopefully well positioned to disseminate the technology, because we're already, like Pallavi was talking about, that there's so many academic projects that are just put up on the shelf after they're done. We very much try to avoid that by creating technologies in collaboration with the stakeholders that are positioned to disseminate that technology out to the real world, so we can avoid that stuck on the shelf analogy. And I think a few key principles in what we do is that we are always trying to look for free market driven value propositions, where we're trying to create technologies that people want to buy and that improve their lives, and that somebody's incentivized to manufacture because they make money, and they're naturally incentivized to scale and sustain the technologies, trying to recognize our own ignorance about these problems. And when we go into another part of the world, I have to know that I'm a guy who grew up in rural New Hampshire, and I know a lot about math and physics, but I don't know anything about what it's like to live as a mother of five, say, in Uganda. I think the final important point is that we try to string together each link in the chain of stakeholders that are going to take an idea all the way out to fruition. Because a really common, I think, folly in our field is that people may focus very much on end users and on their kind of primary requirements that need to be satisfied, but they may forget that there's many other secondary requirements imposed by other stakeholders that if you miss them, it'll kill the project. So things like affordability, how easy it is to manufacture something, how easy is it to distribute it and fix it, and making sure that the incentives are aligned with all the stakeholders in that chain. So to bring together all these ideas, I'm glad you've put up the one slide I wanted to share today. I think about attacking compelling global development opportunities with this Venn diagram, and I want to just talk through that. So the first important part, I think, is finding problems with merit. And these are problems that can be motivated by, say, a sustainable development goal where there's a compelling development challenge. They could be motivated by a compelling unmet economic opportunity. So for example, we do a lot of work in drip irrigation. And there's literally hundreds of millions of farmers who could not only improve their lives through higher productivity of their crop growth, through irrigation, but that's also a massive new market for irrigation companies to engage in and make more money. And I think what's so important about finding a meritorious problem is that not only are you convinced that it's an important problem to tackle, but also that you think about what are the metrics of performance that would need to be satisfied to solve that problem. I can't go in and say, hey, I want to make an irrigation system because I know there's a lot of farmers that need irrigation. I have to say, okay, what are the price points that these farmers can afford? What are the field sizes that we need to design for? What is the operation life of this system? So I need to understand not only my design requirements, but what would satisfy those requirements. Then the next side in the type of work that certainly I do, and I think everybody here is interested about, is I try to find problems that have what I call innovation merit, where they're not a problem that just needs better marketing or just, in a matter of time, a technology might be transferred to a new country, but where there's actually a really difficult technological barrier that needs to be broken through with innovation. And I see this with companies too, where they need to ask themselves, can I adapt my current product line, or do I actually have new design requirements that are going to require innovation? And for me, and I think for an academic environment, innovation merit is really important. And whether or not you have to generate new knowledge for that innovation, to be successful. And I think particularly in research, because I run a research group, I have to think about, like, can we create new knowledge and can we disseminate it through publications? And this is another Achilles heel I see in academic development research all the time, is that people may find a compelling problem, but in terms of research, it might not measure up. It may look like applied engineering knowledge that maybe any company could do. So in my group, I think we've done a good job striking that balance of tackling applied problems where we can say, we can articulate a compelling value proposition where we can make impact on people's lives in the real world, while also saying, here are the knowledge gaps that we need to fill in to do that, and we can publish on those knowledge gaps. So between these two lobes of the Venn diagram, I see a lot of challenges in academia oftentimes, where on the left side, students may be so gung-ho to take a service line class and create a new technology for a developing country, but they have no context. They've never worked there, they've never worked with stakeholders there, and so they're not cognizant of their own ignorance going into that problem, and that really stymies them in creating a good solution. And also I see in a lot of service learning classes, the innovation merit may not be there. They may cobble together widgets that aren't really well engineered, well optimized. So when the technical community looks at them, they say, oh, those are kind of hacked together. That's not really good engineering. And then kind of looking in the other direction from the innovation merit side over to the problem, another Achilles heel I see often in academia is that we have really well-meaning, really motivated colleagues who have developed deep knowledge in a certain technical area, but they don't have a lot of broader real-world context about what it would take to take their technical insights into the real world. And I think Pallavi touched on this a little bit, in that people may come up with these great innovations, the new micro, nano, low power, high efficiency, blah, 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 buzzword technology. And I think academia is really good at maybe addressing those primary design requirements to advance the technology in a certain way. But if you're a subject matter expert, you may not be aware of the real world factors and the secondary requirements, like, is a user going to want to buy it? How would you service it when it breaks? Is it affordable? And so they're somewhat blind oftentimes back to the problem merit factors. So I think in academia, it's really important to balance those viewpoints and think about, do I have a good problem and is there innovation merit? And then finally, in the third lobe at the bottom, value merit is so important, because you have to think about, why is anybody incentivized to work on this problem, and why is anybody incentivized to actually extract the benefits from it if you're successful? So I always think about, who's going to fund the work and what do they care about? Because I'm going to have to pitch this to somebody. And, if I'm pitching the USA versus the Department of Defense, they have different things they care about, and we have been in situations where we pitch the same problem problem, but articulate different value propositions, eliminate the work and why they would want to do it, often by thinking about who's going to make money from it and how can you scale it and sustain it through free market mechanisms. And I'll end by posing to everybody, I think it's so important that all of us think about our own value propositions that make us go into this work. Are you motivated by impacting people's lives, making money, educating students, publishing papers, getting tenure? And I think it's important to be realistic about yourself to say, like, why am I into this? Why are my other partners going into this? And I think that'll help you navigate the value propositions that will eventually lead you to a successful solution. And just to, I guess, reflect on that, in my research group, we work with the market leaders and are funded by the market leaders. And, to reflect on Pallavi's comments, create IP, patent it, because those companies want to hold that IP and make money off it. And we're able to do that because we match up these value propositions. And so I think if you can do this and kind of read the lay of the land and fill in these lobes of this Venn diagram, you can carve out that technological keystone I started talking about in this intro, where that's what I'm always looking for. Is at the center of this, there's some very cool research problem with a very compelling motivation behind it, with new knowledge to be gained. And if we create that keystone, we can build the rest of the arch of the solution and hopefully satisfy the needs of all the stakeholders. So that's my intro. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amos. So I'd like to actually ask a question, because I feel like, Esther, in your remarks, you were focused on a small community or just a community in Kenya, whereas Pallavi and Amos, you're talking about the world almost in your opening remarks. And so I'd actually like to pose the question, starting with Esther, is in your opinion, what is the definition of scalability? How big is scaling? Are we talking about just 30 people, or are we talking about millions when you think of scalability?
The answer to that is a question: how many people are inadequately housed? Yeah, some estimates would say maybe 1 billion, right? So scale for me is big, but then the challenge that we've seen as a community requires both thinking about the global situation and also going to the grassroots level to try to understand things at the community scale. Every single time I've met with, say, architects who are talking about projects that they're doing in an African country or a Latin American country, the numbers that they put on the table are as low as 100. Yeah, so our problem starts actually there. That even within this small community, can we try to get to 10,000 and then 100,000, right? And then the other issue that we see is replicability. The way we do masonry walling, for sure, requires new research because the walls are being subjected to loads that were not there before. Like the pictures that I showed you, they were designed, they're based on knowledge that works for ordinary climatic exposure conditions. If these walls are going to have to deal with the pending and looming flooding events that are coming up, we are going to have to engineer them differently. Yeah, but if we can get that to work, then we can adapt it to several other situations where we have buildings constructed using locally available resources. We can engineer this. So it's, for me, I see it more of like, we look at the global picture, but then we also need to go to the grassroots level and try to understand that, from a built environment perspective, our interventions are not impacting 5,000 people, are not impacting 10,000 people. How are we going to get to 1 billion?
Right. Pallavi, did you have any thoughts?
Yes, and I want to complicate your question a little bit.
Sure.
So I used to be, from when I was a management strategy consultant, I was so sold on this idea that if we have, or anybody has found a solution that works and solves a problem, that just has to go everywhere. It has to be replicated for every individual who's facing that problem. And I think I've reflected on it. I've seen cases where it doesn't work, and I have moved into a different position now. I think the scaling in itself is admirable. It's a good goal to have, but it's not necessary, and it shouldn't be mandatory. I'm saying this to say that if, let's say, we are working at a community level and we have found a problem and we have the solution for that, it's okay that it works at the community level. And let's say my solution works at that community. If someone else in some other community has a version of that problem, they can pick the solution, customize it themselves, and be the owner of that solution and implement it, and that's fine too. So the solution is getting scaled, but I am not the one scaling it. I am more dedicated to the second scenario, that the solution is taking its own form for different individuals and communities who have that problem and is solving that. There's a third scenario, which I'm also like sort of in my head thinking about. If and this is where I think there's a little bit of tension between the academia and the social development work comes in. Academics work on specific problems, right? Let's say water, right? Development sector works on economic empowerment, on social empowerment, right? And it's not just water, it's interconnected. Nutrition is interconnected with education, is interconnected with environment. It's all in, and you can't just solve one problem and think that we will gain the community empowerment. So here, then we are talking about, like Seva the other day. Seva's whole model is so amazing because they don't talk about water or sanitation. They talk about what is the community's problem, and that becomes their problem statement. And then they deliver a solution to that. And in a community, if there are 10 different problems, they actually bring 10 different solutions to that community so that overall community, right, can have that empowerment go up. If you look at BRAC's different program, one of their very applauded program is actually called Ultra Poor Graduation Program. And they have the same model there. They don't do top-down implementation of water solutions and throughout Bangladesh or throughout a country. They actually go into a community that becomes their unit, right? And then they do problem assessment and collect different problems and then work on that. And the unit is their scale, not the problem and not the solution. So there is this tension when we are talking about, we're using the lens of international development sector versus academia. I don't have the answer. I think it's taking in the points from Esther and Amos and building on that. I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize for ourselves, what do we want to do? Are we committed to the problem or are we committed to the solution, right? And then make choices from there.
Right. And I'd actually move on to an audience question because grad student Danielle is hitting on this point. She's asking, what advice would you all give to engineering students who are directed to do very specific technical tasks, but are working on an international development project? Do you have advice or specific strategies for advancing research to make our managers happy while advancing real work? And yes, Pallavi, you did hit on this, but I think she's also asking advice from faculty who may have students who've worked under them and they've had to deal with this tension. And so Amos, I'd like to invite you to provide advice to Danielle and others. And you're on mute, sir.
Thank you. And I'd like to, I will flow into that from, I wanted to add a few points about scaling.
Sure.
I think about scaling, I guess, on multiple scales. And this will touch on the student's comment too. So in terms of like academia and investment in our work, we have to think very much about how do we make the biggest impact we can per dollar. Otherwise, we can very quickly fall into this, like, spend $1 million on a single project, maybe impact a handful of people, which is not a really scalable model. And I think we should take like the Millennium Villages project put on by Jeff Sachs as kind of a cautionary tale, where I think the numbers were, you need about $60 per year per person in a poor community that you need to donate to. But when you scale that up in the level of donation you need, it just becomes financially intractable. The second point about scaling is that I think it's really important, to Esther's comment, to think about like billion person type problems. And that's certainly what I try to codify when I'm putting together a project plan. But it's okay to work on a village level as like a case study. So we do this all the time when we do field pilots. It's not like, so we do these big solar powered desalination systems that are tens of thousands of dollars a pop, we can't do a randomized control trial of those. We're doing one at a time. And we can still set those up in representative situations that teach us about a much broader ecosystem that gives us confidence that it could scale, even though the project is on a singular level. And then the final point I wanted to make about scaling is that I think with our type of work, we're in a great opportunity where necessity drives the mother of invention in terms of creativity, where we have to make high performance but low cost technological solutions where we're often solving problems that have already been solved in wealthy countries, around water and energy that if you live in the US or Europe, you're not facing every day. So it's not like there's a lack of solutions. We're coming up with a new solution space that can hit the performance targets similar to what we have in wealthy countries, but at a much lower price point. If you can do that, you can create a globally disruptive technology where you can sell it in poor countries, but also disrupt the equivalent technology in wealthy countries. And that's another thing that I'm always looking for. And that process is called reverse innovation, where you create that high performance, low cost product line that can work in poor and rich countries alike. So to get back to the students' comment, I see this a lot in students where they're tasked on a research project and the research project is deep. It's important to be deep. You have to have depth in a PhD, but you can go down a rabbit hole in terms of depth and lose your peripheral vision to see the impact or the potential for impact. And my advice to a student is always try to jump back and forth between depth and breadth, to be asking yourself, what is motivating this project? If I meet my design requirements, what would the next steps be to disseminate this? As I look in the broader context, are there other design requirements I should maybe think about beyond just the technical focused research ones that I'm focusing on for my doctoral work that I should also include in my research? And I think the way we train graduate students, it does kind of promote them to or encourage them to put the blinders on to look deep. And I think we're good at that because papers and theses come out of that. But try to always take that step back and look broader and ask yourself, why am I doing this? What is the impact? And I would say it's okay for you to ask your advisor that too. And I always encourage that feedback from my students and we have those discussions like, why are we doing this? Are our incentives and objectives aligned with the real world? Are we, the worst thing you can do is march really fast in the wrong direction, right? So that iterative nature of course correcting is really valuable. Sorry for that long answer, but hopefully I addressed the question.
No, you're right on target because yesterday's panel was about iterative implementation and adaptation. So thank you for making that linkage for us to yesterday's panel. Esther, I'd actually like to build off of, because this is a question I was going to ask you anyways. Amos mentioned reciprocal innovation. He called it something else, but at Purdue we call it reciprocal innovation. You spoke about cotton and peanut agricultural farming. I'm from the state of Virginia, which the two largest products at one point were cotton and peanuts. And Virginia is also home to an island called Tangier Island in the middle of Chesapeake Bay. It takes 4 hours by boat to get to give you a sense of how large the Chesapeake Bay is. And it's sinking. It's been in the news for sinking. And so they've had to adapt their agricultural and fishing project work. And it's just examples like that where I think, wow, in Kenya, I never would have thought cotton and peanuts were a well-known product there. I'm not suggesting you work in Virginia, but it just highlights to me the opportunity for reciprocal innovation is universal. So I'm just curious, how has that played out in the research you've done, and what role do you think it plays in scaling for impact, particularly in the work?
All right. Yeah, thank you. So I'll borrow a leaf from Amos and add to his response, then answer your question. So the question that the student asked, that was me. I did my PhD in artificial intelligence. I was being sponsored by a private company in London. It was high tech. And I remember even when I was signing up, I was asking my PhD advisor, like, but this is a problem because, I want to work in the context of low income population. Like the course I really wanted to get into had the title Minimum Cost Architecture. So I was like, you're killing me. Why am I doing this artificial intelligence? And, but the way, we talked about it. So to Amos's point that it is good to always ask, like, I was like, this is my career trajectory. This is what I want to do. This artificial intelligence is very global now. And large commercial buildings in London, New York, etc. The way we ended the conversation that gave me comfort, yeah, was being able to package it as an information management and knowledge sharing problem, right? So at that level, that was just an example of an opportunity for me to use a case study approach to see how AI could help a human to human interaction problem, right? And when I came to that conclusion, I was at peace, because for me it was like, it's about the human to human communication. How do they deal with the information overload? How do they find what is relevant? How do we incentivize them through reducing information overload to consider all possible options? So now connecting it back to your question, Diane, that I think it's again something that Pallavi had said, that even within the global building network, dissemination is very important. And it is dissemination that is being packaged for different audiences. Actually, in my sector, our problem is known. We write papers that nobody within that small group will really read. We know that. And everybody is complaining about that. Like we want our information that we've spent a lot of time researching on to be used. Like when people are redesigning or reconstructing in one project, we are looking at the reconstruction efforts in Mozambique. And we want to see, like, can some of the knowledge that's coming out of the disaster risk resilient housing community inform the rebuilding? And if it can do that, can it inform what sinking communities are doing to try to prepare for the crisis that is looming, right? So it's the sharing of the information. And I think it's the conversation, for me at least, because a house is very personal. If you want me to change something about the house that I live in, you have to present the information in a way that makes sense to me. Most of us are very busy, and my students summarize it by telling me, I ask them, how do you consume information? They're like, anything that I can scroll through my phone very, very quickly, I'm going to read that. Yeah, I've talked to people who work in very labor-intensive sectors, jobs, and they tell me that by the time I reach my house at 6 p.m., I have no energy. I don't even have energy to cook. So whatever it is you want to tell me, 5 bullet points, right? So I think like what you shared, I'm very interested in that. My interest will be different from the person by the shores of Lake Victoria. My attention span with, maybe I'm curious, I'm intellectually engaged in this topic. I get rewarded by showing evidence that this is happening. The other person is motivated by different things. I think we've neglected investing in storytelling, for example, the art of storytelling and how to use that as a tool for communication, right? So I see lots of opportunities for us to stitch together these ideas of how do we use case studies to connect research ideas in the lab to problems in the real world. How do we use all the options that are available for dissemination of information to reach as many different people as possible? And for me, that is where my professor told me several years ago when I was doing my PhD, yeah, think of it as information management and knowledge management. Who's your audience and how do you package this for them?
Thank you. So we actually have a few other audience questions, and actually I think you ended up answering one of the other ones, Esther. Danielle, again, she was asking, how do you incentivize someone to adapt their home to accommodate, in her case, ventilating kitchens, but those homes could also benefit from solar. So you ended up indirectly answering her question. I'm going to scroll back up though, and I'm going to get us lost in IP because I know half of our panelists love to talk about IP. So let's talk a little bit about first, Amos, if I could ask you, have there been circumstances where you have declined funding at your lab because the problem or the innovation doesn't have enough merit, as you highlight in your diagram?
It typically doesn't get to the point where I'm like ripping up a check that somebody wrote to us, but it happens all the time to me where I will be at a company and I can see they have a technical problem that I could address, but it's an applied engineering problem. It may be interesting to me, but it doesn't have the knowledge component required to, I think, have that innovation merit and really research merit. So yeah, I guess I'm in the position where I can think like, yeah, I could maybe sell our lab to do that work, but it's not worth our time. Like you have to think about, I think there's always the vision of an academic that they're always hustling for money, which is true. But, even though we're professional beggars, we have to be choosers at the same time. Um, in thinking about what are we signing ourselves up to, and what sort of opportunity cost there is. So yeah, I think about that all the time. And I would flip this around a little bit too. What I do a lot of is I will get a sense of where like a problem area is that I'm interested in, and I think the group could make an impact. And I'll go out and reach out to a leader in that field, typically a company, um, and go talk with them and try to understand what is their vision of an opportunity for their company. Where do they want to grow? Where do they want to get more market share? And I go through this courtship process of trying to align their incentives with my interests in the skill set of my group. And through those interactions, we often find like, wow, there's this really cool research opportunity that if we're successful, would be super valuable for the company. And then it's a win-win for all. And I do the same thing with funders as well. And I think one thing, I guess a parting message in this topic that I give to people is, if you're really excited about an idea and trying to raise money for it, you're not trying to pitch your vision of what you're excited about. You need to pitch what the funder is going to be excited about. So you need to craft your narrative in a way that will resonate with them and tick the boxes that they care about. And it's not like you're compromising your vision. You just have to translate it in a way that'll be exciting to people. And I heard in Esther's comment a lot about this translation. We have to be translators. We have to translate our work to the research community. We have to translate our work to the funding community, and then translate it to the practitioner community. And all those communities like speak different languages, but if you could figure those out, you can engage well with all of them.
Yeah, we have an example here of an engineering education project who she was able to successfully make the case for why teaching students in low resource settings would help promote American diplomacy and American ideals, which no one would automatically make that link on their own, but she was able to make the case to the funder.
I'd make that link even more, or I've had that link made more explicitly to me. We had multiple US government funding agencies during the Trump administration years say, even though you're doing international development, you need to tell a narrative of how it makes America great again. And I don't mean that to go into any political direction. We just had to say that narrative about how does this come back and positively affect the US. And like I said before, about looking at creating high performance, low cost technologies that can work in wealthy countries and poor countries, we use that narrative all the time and say, look, this technology is going to come back and benefit Americans, or maybe it can be made in the US and shipped abroad. So I don't ever feel like I'm being insincere.
Right.
I just try to understand the value proposition for all the players involved.
That's right. And that's how you successfully scale your work, to be honest. So let me take another question from a student before we talk about IP, actually. So Luke asks, Amos, you mentioned analyzing problems that have a large scale or potential for scale. How do you find these problems where the solution would have a big impact and it has at least sustainable market potential, yet no one's making progress on it, or where a lab can make meaningful progress? Do you find them in emerging market reports, global governance reports, qualitative academic research? Where do you find them?
My answer to all those questions is yes. And I guess what I would advise is it takes time. It takes a lot of time. We'll spend a few years sometimes just to try to clarify a problem in an objective for our work. We've had sponsors joke with us. We look like the financial arm of a company, giving all these like market assessments and like monetary calculations. But yeah, we go in to try to understand, not only what would impact people's lives, but what are they incentivized to adopt? You always have to remember, people tend to do things they want to do rather than things they have to do or should do. Like if you look at, obesity in the US, or like drunk driving, like these are things where there's a very clear solution to that problem, but enacting it is much, much more complicated just because of human psychology. So we have to understand that space. we have to, I'll give you an example of like the monetary side of things. Just recently, we started working with Toro, which is one of the market leaders in drip irrigation. And the big merit of our research portfolio is that we can cut pumping power in drip irrigation systems to make them cheaper to run off solar. And that's what's good for the developing world. Toro's primary market is not in developing countries. It's in the US, in the Americas, North and South America. And so we had to figure out like where is the value proposition for them, and we're actually smaller than what they currently design, and we can dramatically cut the material usage. And because those products are commodities, cutting your material costs by, you know, for us, it's about 30%, is a massive boom to their profit margins, structure of their business, and put it like frame it in a way of like, this is what we could provide. And even though we're still providing our low pressure systems and we care about that for the developing world, we added in this additional value that really resonated with them. And that's part of the reason they're funding us. And then I said that one more point I'd say is that it's very easy to fall into traps where you kind of take the word of God from individual stakeholders. And what we often have to do is kind of find the average and also find where, like, what different perspectives are telling us, because like a farmer is going to have a different perspective than like the executive of a company. And I guess as a parting note on this topic, I would say the most powerful tool you have as an innovator is perspective, if you can get it. And what I mean by that is if you can actively see the world through other people's eyes, through other stakeholders' eyes, you will get a view on their constraints and requirements. You'll get a view on your own biases and assumptions. And if you can put together a more comprehensive set of design requirements, you're going to be less likely to not meet them and thus be more likely to be successful. So you mitigate risk. And this is important because the only reason designs fail is because requirements were not met. And what's so hard about the work we do is we're going into contexts where we have no idea what the design requirements are. So put yourself in that position to try to understand them, and you're less likely to fail.
Right, thank you. So on to IP. So Esther, very quickly, I'm curious, does Penn State have IP terms that are similar to those that Pallavi described?
Yes. So that's the short answer. So I'm also working in engineering entrepreneurship, and I'm actually, as I said earlier, I'm currently giving a virtual class in the Philippines every night from 9 p.m. And the difference, I guess, between some of the emerging and developing countries and here is the motivation structure. So bringing this back to the research perspective, that the group that I'm working with, they are more interested in revenue sharing, actually the profit sharing, right? And it's less about the IP. But then, as you know, for most professors, we are also on this, tenure and promotion, tenure track. So this becomes a challenge. If I'm an assistant professor looking for tenure and promotion, I have to choose. Do I want to do this via the entrepreneurial route, meaning I will have limited opportunity to get points for my tenure and promotion, or do I want to do it for my tenure and promotion? So I am in the second group, the people who want to do the engineering research that has impact, while also demonstrating that it has intellectual merit, so I can put it in my dossier when I'm going up for tenure and promotion. And then I think also adding what Amos said, and I'm not answering the question, but explaining where I'm coming in from. My motivation is being born and brought up in a developing country. I cannot tell a sob story because I'm from a middle-income family, but I have relatives who that was their life and their reality. And there are many diaspora population members, so I'm going there, that there is knowledge that is often not shared because people are afraid that somebody is going to commercialize on my ideas. So I think it's like a balancing act somewhere that, there is a value in going via the IP route, but for community engagement, especially when you're dealing with people who are from the international communities, there's also been very many concerns about the true ownership of ideas. So for a lot of the things that we are doing, we've embraced open innovation, open source. When we are coding, we are big on open source, open innovation. And yes, I am affiliated with companies. I'm a shareholder in a company, but we are also encouraging as much as possible open innovation.
Thank you. So Pallavi, I'm curious then, how would you pitch and sell, explain, convince, your IP structure when talking to faculty, nonprofits, and community and the like?
Yeah, easiest question ever, Diana. Thank you for that. Uh, how do I change the most archaic system in the world?
Yeah.
So here's again, I'm not an expert. I'm also not, a researcher and academic. So I have a different sort of stand on this. But here's what I think. IP research shows that IPs do not always end up generating revenue or do not always end up benefiting the inventor. Mostly because most of the IPs in the corporate world are being used for competitive advantage. I.e., if somebody wants to do this, they can't do this because I already patented it, right? Universities do that too. And the research that I quoted before actually shows that not more than 16% ever in a university goes into commercialization. So think about this. We are talking about a world where there is, the universities and the corporates are amassing brilliant technologies and solutions, but we are all holding on to it so that we get the competitive advantage. If it does come to that, right? That we will gain from it in future. If somebody else wants to do it, they can't do it, right? So that's just, I'm setting the stage, and I'm of course exaggerating a little bit, but that's where we are at. Now, bringing it down to our current situation, and to exemplify the two cases, one is the polio vaccine, and the other one is the COVID vaccine, AstraZeneca in specific, Oxford. Polio vaccine inventor, nobody knows the name of that inventor. And I read a case study long back. When the vaccine was invented, the inventor said, I know if I put a name on it, if I patent it, it's not going to get to every individual who needs it around the world. So they did not patent it. And we have eradicated polio. Lastly, it was, I think, in Pakistan, eradicated like a couple of years back. We are free of polio. Now compare it with the COVID situation where AstraZeneca, and by the way, the major research that happens in university is public funded, right? But public funded patents, public funded research results in patent getting amassed in the university is not necessarily resulting in impact. Or in this case, if government is going back and buying it, is paying for it again and at much higher cost. So compare it with the COVID vaccine. Oxford and multiple other researchers, decades old research, resulted in this vaccine. And the narrative, and I'll invite Amos's comment on that because we have talked about it before, but the narrative from Gates Foundation, heavy-handedness here was we need to bring in market forces to manage the quality of the product because it's a new kind of vaccine and whatnot. So let's patent it and let's bring in an experienced manufacturer, AstraZeneca in this case, to produce it to an extent that we can manage the quality and give it out to the world to use it. It all sounds good, but the reality of the situation is there is we need to manage those. So, okay, let me dial back a bit. There are two problems as I see it happening here. Firstly, if it's a big problem like COVID, you cannot create a bottleneck of having limited few manufacturers to manage quality. Secondly, and I'm reading through all these papers and news articles that are coming out because of the situation back home in India and the emergency need for vaccine. All these papers are actually saying that it is not grounded in reality, that the existing manufacturers in developing countries cannot manage the quality. Albeit, of course, there has to be a knowledge transfer that has to happen. And all this discussion actually has just resulted into yesterday's Biden administration saying that they're going to promote, lifting patents that are there on, like AstraZeneca vaccine, i.e. acknowledging that yes, maybe our assumptions that the quality cannot be managed via knowledge transfer and via incorporating stakeholders from developing countries, and that we need patent. All that to actually say that I personally am getting more and more convinced that IPA do not necessarily benefit inventors. If at all it gets used, it's used for competitive advantage, i.e. corporates and, private organizations benefiting it from most. And thirdly, I'm forgetting the name, but, this recent book about how racism brings the whole world down. It's not just something that costs a certain community. It costs all of draining the pool, right? Draining the pool. It's like there's a beautiful example there where it says, anyway, I'm going too deep into it. But my point is, IP, I think, is a way of hoarding that brings the value down for the whole community and not necessarily providing value to the inventor in the first place. I have a patent with IBM on database relational, some algorithm, and I haven't received a single dollar from it. It's with IBM. They're holding on it. They're not even using it. They're sitting on it to have competitive advantage. So that's my pitch, if I can convince anyone with it.
And Amos and Esther, do you have any comments? Probably also holding patents yourself.
Yeah, we file a lot of patents. My answer is it all depends. I can't just say IP is good or bad. I think in an emergency response situation like COVID, I think trying to maintain equity in the world and like make sure everybody gets the opportunity to get vaccinated. I think it may require rethinking typical IP strategies. And so maybe it makes sense to either do free licensing, which is different than open sourcing. But I think the world needs to rally around things like that. I think it also really depends on what you're creating. So there's very good examples of open source technology around software, like Raspberry Pi or Linux, and that works really well. And that has promoted the dissemination of those innovations. When you're talking about hardware, it gets a lot trickier because hardware takes a lot more of an investment to make, and it also, every time you type the letter A in code, it comes out as an A. Every time you machine a letter A out of aluminum, it's a little different. And so IP has different meaning in the physical space, and I can't give you really any large-scale dissemination examples of physical products that were like open sourced and were very successful. That competitive advantage that comes with IP is really important, certainly for all of my sponsors, not only in a market advantage, but also it's important to me in terms of quality control. If you Google me, you'll see a bunch of stuff about wheelchairs, and there was a wheelchair I did a lot of work on years ago that is for developing countries, and we've had many requests to make it open source so anybody can make it in the world. And the reason we've not done that is because we can't control quality at all. Somebody could make a chair that looks like ours and it's dangerous and it doesn't work well, and that hurts the whole brand and the whole quality or the whole perception of quality of the device. So I think you kind of have to take it at a case by case basis. But I think if I look at where where the bias is of the likely situation, I think most times if you've come up with something of value and don't be very clear to differentiate between what you can patent and what is commercially valuable, because there's lots of patents most patents sit on a shelf because they're not valuable enough to manufacture. But if you come up with something commercially valuable that somebody's incentivized to disseminate, I think typically you're going to be in the best position to patent it.
So can I ask, Amos, in the case of Purdue, we have PICS bags, which is our sort of gold standard for scaling for impact. And in that case, we trademarked it, and that allowed us to ensure quality for bags to have the PICS, the Purdue crop name on it. People can go out and try to replicate it, but they can't use that name. Do you feel like that's sufficient, sort of knowledge transfer and then like name control? Do you think is that an option?
I don't know. I don't have a good consequence because I'm not familiar with the product, but I don't know the consequences of people making knockoffs and like how that could damage consumers and produce brand. But trademarking is another mechanism in copywriting for IP protection. You can copyright code too. Um, it's maybe hard to enforce and it's easy to work around sometimes, but yeah, it sounds like that was a good route for Purdue, and I don't have any problem with that. I think it all depends.
Esther, do you have any thoughts?
Yes. So I agree with Amos that this may not be a black and white thing. It depends on the situation. And I was using the open innovation with respect to the community within which we are doing this disaster risk resilient housing. It was within that context. And the issues that we're dealing with revolve around trust. And I think also within the pandemic, we've learned that it's related, that the uptake of vaccination amongst the vulnerable populations is very low because there's no trust. They're like somebody is taking advantage of our plight to make money, and they don't know the consequences. I mean, they don't know the side effects. So the trust is just not there. So it's not happening. And the similar thing is happening even in Kenya. The vaccination rates are embarrassingly very low. I was proud of my parents. They went and got the vaccine. I was half expecting them to refuse. So I think, and there have been examples of, genetically modified food, GMOs. And in Kenya, this caused such a big controversy that it had to be paused. There was a presidential task force. So it was not about the science, it was more about the profiteering, that somebody is characterizing our soil and using knowledge that we are giving them to maximize profits, and we're getting nothing out of it. So I think in those kinds of situations, we really need to now delve into the equity, the perception of exploitation. Those are things which are awakening wounds from way back, that it doesn't matter how much science you put on the table. They are convinced that this organization doesn't have our best interest at heart. And for the housing, I think I'll use the example of interventions that are being used to fix poor quality housing, even right here in the US. Historically, when it is successful, the property values go up, people get displaced, right? So it's not just about who's making the money, but someone who was at a disadvantage is left even more greatly disadvantaged. So I think as part of the conversation, listening to the voices of the communities that we're trying to impact, listening to their concerns. If they say we are not comfortable with this route because of X, we have to stop. I was supposed to be in a meeting at 11 o'clock where we're dealing with this. We're trying to help the community. Somebody came up with an idea. Let's have an AI platform that can be used to capture their lived experiences. And that sounded like a good idea. But when they engaged with the community members did not like it. They not like it. And I say, I think it's how they're interpreting this phrase, AI platform. So I'm like, how about we experiment with AI enhanced, right? An AI enhanced documentation of their lived experiences. Yeah, the platform is not doing it. The platform is helping you tell the story. And from a quantitative perspective, we need to switch that. Again, going back to Amos's point about translation, it's not just translation like talking to other people, it's also translation for me as a quantitative person to realize that without certain keywords, you say community engagement, yeah, they want community participation. Yeah, they don't want to be just engaged. So these interactions that we have with the different stakeholders, if we open our ears, we listen to their concerns, we listen to their pain points, I'm sure we will find mechanisms through which this IP may be acceptable to them because the underlying trust issues and wounds have been discussed and resolved to their satisfaction.
Thank you. So we're approaching the end of our session. I could certainly wrap up with an example, but I'd also like to invite you all, if you have any final thoughts to share with our audience. Okay.
Well, I'm happy to.
Please, Amos, please.
Yeah. Just one final thought, and it ties into what Esther was just saying. And I think it ties into IP. Like, I wanted to stress again, like, really try to see the world through other people's eyes. And in this conversation of IP, I don't think about much what I want to do or what MIT may want to do. I want to think about like who's in a position to disseminate the work and what do they care about? Do they want protection or do they want it freely donated? And I think that's what you have to care about. And I think, you know, if you can see the world through other people's eyes, you're going to be better equipped to check your own biases and your assumptions, and hopefully understand the full set of design requirements that have to be satisfied to solve the problem you care about. So that's my parting words.
Thank you. So I'll end with an example. It's not an engineering one, but I feel like it sums up a lot of the points and questions I was trying to raise today. I think, I hope most Americans know the name Stacey Abrams by now. She ran for office in Georgia. She lost by about 55,000 votes. And she took a step back, and it wasn't because of fundraising, and it wasn't, you know, self-absorbed reasons. She thought that was such a an issue that she took it upon herself to help register people to vote. She then swung a presidential election. I think Georgia's gap was 10,000 votes. So I was asking you about scale because she dealt in the hundreds of thousands, 10,000s of people. You know, you all pointed out that while you may work in one sector, you may be impacting another. You work in agriculture, but you impact nutrition. In her case, she just registered people for votes. She swung a nation's election results, perhaps unintentionally. So I think it's just important to, and again, what Amos was highlighting is to always be prepared to look big, look small, look left, look right, look all around, rather than just straight down and linear at the problem you're trying to solve. Because you know, it's not always one thing that prevents you from scaling your solution, and you may not even be addressing the right problem. So with that, I'll end it here. Thank you, Amos and Esther, for canceling meetings and joining us on the road. Thank you, Pallavi, too, for stepping in at the last minute and being able to share with us the great work and value you've added to us here at the Purdue community with our IP considerations. And we look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow at the last day of our expo. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, everybody.